这一期呢，咱说点跟当下情况比较相关的事儿哈，像这个美联储降息，市场利率不降反升，人工智能领域更是恨不得每天都有新动向。那另外，虽说这个川胖刚入主白宫没多久哈，但是从他还没当选一直到现在，每天都能靠出其不意上头条。
We are the federal law.
最近更是整个一关税侠。这期呢，我找到了有25年经验的资深投资经理人 Michael Lebowitz。Even
though the Fed cut rates, they raised rates.
来跟大家分享一下，从他的这个角度上哈，他是怎么来思考现在我们面临的像这个通胀啊、贷款环境啊，还有在动荡时期的投资思路的。当然呢，我也会在里面穿插一些常青的知识哈，比如说像为什么美联储其实现在对市场利率已经失控了，希望能够帮助大家建立一个更完整的思维体系。I remember last time I saw you here in Houston actually, you mentioned that possibly the inflation is not going to pick up. Why do you think the inflation is not going up by the rate coming down?
First of all, let's talk about what the Fed did do. The Fed lowered rates, but all they lowered was the Fed funds rate. That's the rate that banks borrow from each other overnight. It's a one-day, a less than 24-hour loan. That's not really pertinent to me or you who's buying a house or a car or a corporation that's looking to build a factory or spend money to invest in something.
那我们先来讲一个我最常被问到的一个问题，那我相信也是很多人一直很困惑的一个问题，就是为什么美联储在降息，但是呢，市场里面的贷款利率一直不下降？那这里面的原因呢，我们可以提两个哈。那第一个呢，就是美联储调整利率并不能直接影响市场里面的贷款利率。那因为呢
So what really matters to the economy, which ultimately then inflects upon inflation, is what happens with 5-year rates, with 10-year rates, with 30-year rates, and if you even 2-year rates. And if you look at the yield curve since the Fed cut rates, at one point, 5, 10, and 30-year rates were almost 1% higher. They've come down a little bit in the last week or two, but they still remain very high. So what I would say is in an indirect way, even though the Fed cut rates, they raised rates.
在这里我知道有些朋友可能说，为什么这个3年、5年、10年期国债收益率对于市场影响更大呢？这事儿之前我在给订阅了我邮箱列表的朋友的这个邮件里面其实解释过哈，但鉴于我这频道还是有很多朋友是没有在我这个邮件列表里面，或者是新来的一些观众，那所以我也在这儿再口头解释一下哈。当然如果大家想加入到我邮件列表里的话呢，链接呢就在这个描述栏里面，那这一期的文字稿呢也在描述栏里面，大家可以去看。咱们现在就假设好咱自己是放贷款的，那我们在放出比如说一笔10年期贷款的时候呢，那我们肯定会预想到这笔贷款是有还不上的可能性的。那为了去抵消这种风险的话呢，我们一般会有2种思路。第一种呢，就是说我手里得有个抵押品，那比如说哈，咱们去给一个商业地产放一笔10年期的贷款，那这个贷款合同其中肯定是得提到，要是还不上的话，那这地产我是不是得收上来呀？那作为放贷方，那除了考虑这个抵押品的问题以外呢，还要考虑到这个应该到底放多高的利率比较合适，这就需要参考一个标准了。鉴于这个放出10年期贷款的这个事儿呢是有一定风险的哈，那需要参考的指标就是一无风险的回报应该是有多高的。那这个无风险的回报就是同期的国债收益率是多少，那也就是10年期国债收益率嘛。那当然要是放5年期贷款的话呢，那就对标5年期国债收益率，以此类推哈。作为放贷方呢，就得去衡量这个左手边这个10年期无风险的回报和右手边这个10年期有风险的回报。那如果想要放这10年期有风险回报贷款的话，应该在这个10年期无风险的这个收益率上加多少的回报，才能抵消掉放出这笔贷款所带来的风险。这就是为什么其实这个美联储的利率跟市场里面的利率有关，但呢也不是那么大。
Their dovish policy was hawkish in a weird way. Whether they intended that to be, we don't know. But what it's doing is it's making lending less likely or borrowing less likely, which takes away from economic activity. It makes it harder to service existing debts or debts that have to roll over. And therefore, it on its own, without any other factors, is disinflationary. The other point I would argue is that interest rates are too high. Our economy has largely gone back to where it was before the pandemic. Almost all that stimulus is out of the system. Therefore, at least in my opinion, I think that all those trends from before the pandemic, productivity, debt outstanding, all the trends that were demographics, those trends that were slowly pushing our economic growth rate lower and keeping a lid on inflation are re-exerting themselves.
You mentioned just a little bit earlier about 5-year and 10-year treasury yield that are actually going up. But why going up instead of coming down? Like, what's the expectation of the market?
So I think it's partially the market is scared.
Mm.
There's this term out there called bond vigilantes. Bill Gross, I think it was Bill Gross from PIMCO, invented that term 30 years ago, 20 years ago in the mid 90s. Shows you how old I am. And basically the term was meant to be like protesters, bond investors that were protesting high deficits, or in this case, inflation. So to protest, they short bonds, basically putting pressure on bond yields to rise. So this became a popular trade on Wall Street over the last 3 months, 6 months, to short bonds. Deficit, what we hear from them all the time is that deficits are out of control and that inflation will be rising significantly. We're going to go through a repeat of what we saw in the 70s and 80s.
That sounds like the concept that everybody is talking about.
That's the fear.
Yeah.
So when you promote that fear, yields rise. People sell their bonds and yields increase. So the fact that the Fed is lowering rates in an environment where those fears persist, that just heightens those fears. It makes them worse. And so what we saw was yields increase despite the overnight rate decrease.
市场利率上升，另外一个原因呢，就是这个 term premium， 中文翻译过来呢，就叫做期限溢价。这个我之前邮箱列表里面也讲过哈。
So there's a term premium in most things in our life. Let's pretend we can assign a value to your house, right? Let's just say your house is worth $500,000 because of X, Y, and Z. But we know that if you were to sell your house today, it would sell for $700,000 or $300,000. That's difference is what we call the term premium, or if it's below the term discount. And it's what it does is it reflects the market's fears. It's like sentiment in the stock market. If we say that a fair value for a stock is a PE of 18, but it trades with a PE of 30, that's a term premium. It's not because of the fundamentals, it's because investors are buying more of it. So in a bond market, we can tell you what the value of that house is, so to speak. We know that with inflation expectations, we get inflation expectations from the market, from the bond markets via tip yields, and we get it from surveys. And we know what inflation has been from a number of different sources. When we take that and we factor in economic growth rates, we have a very good idea of where treasury bond yields should be. And that model has an incredibly high correlation with bond yields. So if we know where bond yields should be and we know where bond yields are, we can quantify how much that fear-mongering, or it's not necessarily fear-mongering, concern over deficits and inflation are causing the bond market.
期限溢价的背后其实是一个市场期待的问题哈。那就虽然说期限溢价从数据上来讲是可以估算的，但是期限溢价背后这个市场参与者的心理活动是不太好量化的。那这我在上一期内容里面提到这个行为经济学的部分也大概解释了一下为什么哈。那欢迎大家回看。
Once you know the value, you know where the yield is, and it's that difference in between. So the hard part, in my opinion, is what's the right value? What should the treasury bond yield? You also need historical data on where the term premium has been. Because if the term premium's kind of all over the place and it happens to be, high now, that may be more of a norm. But what we find today is it's the highest it's been since 1990. And statistically, it's about 3 standard deviations above the norm. It's extreme. What that means, and we were talking about this morning, is that bond yields could fall almost 1%, let's just say today, tomorrow, without any of the fundamentals, right? The fundamentals we discussed were inflation and economic growth. If those do not change, they just stay exactly as they are, bond yields could fall by 1% if that premium gets erased.
那现在我们观察到的影响这些心理活动的因素都有哪些呢？
Fear of deficits. You know, we've also had some relatively good inflation data over the last couple of weeks, but we're watching Elon Musk in action, cutting government, you know, slicing and dicing government. We're watching Donald Trump getting, you know, making statements that he wants to get rid of this and that and cut spending. The market may be starting to alleviate its fears that deficits will keep running as high as they've been for the last couple of years, that they may slowly start to decline. That's helping. And again, inflation data hasn't pointed to much lower inflation, but it's also not pointing to higher inflation. So you've kind of taken out the two key fundamental underpinnings of that extended term premium.
It sounds like we're stuck at a point that the Fed is having a hard time to make any move, because the lower that the rate gets, it sounds like the more deflationary the whole market will be, fundamentals will be. And then people will still feel the fear of, you know, uncertainty with the new administration. So we're kind of stuck at the position that we don't even know we should move which way.
That's a huge point you just made. I like to say the Fed's handcuffed. They just can't do anything. They don't want to raise rates because they think rates are already too high. And they know that rates happen with a lag effect. So it takes time. They raise rates today. The effect doesn't happen for 6, 9 months, 12 months, even up to 2 years.
Right.
If we're going into a recession in 3 or 4 months and they're raising rates now, they are making that recession worse in the future. So they don't want to raise rates. And they've mentioned that in various ways numerous times. And Chairman Powell always speaks about the lag effect. And it's kind of proven that there is a lag effect. Sometimes that lag is really short. Sometimes it's really long, like this instance. But they also don't want to cut rates either, because they're scared of promoting that fear in the bond market. The last thing they want to do is cut rates, but send rates up even higher, right? Because that's essentially they're raising rates even though they're cutting them, which is what happened at the last couple meetings. What this unfortunately means is that the Fed is going to be scared, for lack of a better word, to cut rates, scared to raise rates if they think they need to. And policy will not be as reflective of what they should be doing have they not these fears.
川胖绝对是会搞真人秀的哈，他上来这1个月，那真是天天都出爆梗。那根据我们现在看到的这些情况呢，他想要制造业回归，想要美元贬值，又要去给币圈站台，张罗收购格陵兰岛，把加拿大当做美国的第51个州，还继承了慈禧他老人家那套政治思路哈，给全世界都加关税，完全不按套路出牌。他到底想干啥呢 ？With Trump just got into the office and he's already making huge moves and he's not even every day, like he's not even doing it in a very political way. He's using a whole business strategy to deal with the relationship between countries, like, you know, scare Canada and Mexico with the tariff and stuff. It's kind of fun, like it's almost like a big business negotiation taking place in real life. What do you see his policy is really going to? Like, is it going to help with certain industry? Is it going to tank the other? Like, he's pretty much unpredictable, but what is your point on that?
The tariffs in particular,
yeah,
I think are a bargaining stick. Look, we're never going to bring back production in any scale back to America. We just make too much money. We you know what, this country has been incredibly successful, and we have raised the wealth of the individuals of this nation. Even our poor are much richer than most other nations' poor. Right. And because of that, to be most effective, You want the countries that are best producing certain things to produce those things.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to get in the way. So if a country can produce tires cheaper than us because they have cheaper labor, let them produce the tires. Let us produce those things that we're good at producing, technology, services, the stuff that's actually better for GDP. That when you get in the way of that with tariffs, you're not taking advantage of all these opportunities abroad and at home. And if you think that some of these companies are going to be producing stuff here, paying people $25 an hour versus other countries at $5 or $10 an hour, without unions and without regulations, you're crazy. They'll figure out, they may bring it back to this country to appease the president, but they're going to figure out how to get robots in those jobs as soon as possible because they're going to not make nearly as much money. And at the end of the day, we all know that corporations care most about their bottom line.
I know this USMCA that Trump had put in place with Canada and Mexico. The workers who work on making these products needs to get paid for a certain amount. Like these kind of
Right.
policies, I'm a little surprised. It's really against the free market.
Well, I feel like he's mixing policies. He's applying economic policies to achieve other results. So Mexico, to me, is the clearest example of this. It's pretty obvious we need to stop the fentanyl trade and we need to curb immigration, illegal immigration. And Mexico is the prime suspect for both of those. Fentanyl is just pouring over those borders, as is illegal immigration from Mexico, but from all other parts of the world through Mexico. So instead of taking an action directed exactly towards that, building a massive fence or putting our troops on a border or whatever you want to do, he just went to Mexico and said, we're basically going to, put a huge tariff on your imports, figure out this problem today. It's effective. Or so far, it seems like it's effective, but you're mixing two policies. You're putting an economic policy in place of a drug policy or an immigration policy. And the result could, if it backfires, could be harmful on both sides.
This is the issue when you have a businessman running the country like a politician.
But it's effective so far. Nothing else has been effective. So we'll see. We're really not going to know if it's effective for 6 months or a year. Something had to be done. And unfortunately for us, tariffs are the only, that's always the big stick Trump likes to wave.
Because he's using economic policies to treat political problems, it's definitely going to affect the US market in different industries. So what do you see those industries are, and what kind of impact do you think it's going to have within the United States?
Well, Ford today came out with their earnings, and their earnings and revenues were actually a little better than expected, but the stock opened down about 5%. And keep in mind, the stock is about $9, $10 a share. The stock was in the 20s 3 years ago. And if you go all the way back to 1994, 95, it was at $10 a share. Stock's gone nowhere for 30 years. It's they've lost market share. They failed to keep up with EV and electric vehicles. Then they finally got into electric vehicles and they're losing money. And so they announced earnings and revenue and they were better than the market thought, but the stock was down. And it's because the CEO came out and said that if these tariffs are invoked against Canada and Mexico, we're going to get killed. Because when we assemble cars, we assemble them in America, but also in Canada and Mexico and parts. They're not assembled all in one place anymore. They're assembled in pieces and put together. And for the auto industry, a lot of that occurs in Canada and Mexico. So Ford's a great example of a company that's really potentially getting, whacked by tariffs. And I'm sure GM is in very similar shoes. And to a lesser degree, all the car companies that sell in America.
那很多朋友会觉得这个讲金融财经话题的都喜欢讲这些负面儿的消息。我承认，从传媒角度上来说，这个肯定是讲坏事儿它更吸睛啊。但是我个人对这事儿的看法是这样的哈，不管是什么样的市场，都会有赢家和输家。那市场好和不好只是一个宏观的一个现象。作为投资人来说呢，很多时候最好的机会反而是在这些所谓经济不好的时期出现的。For the public market, I mean, it's more of a numbers game than private market is more like an analysis game. Public market, where do you think the potential opportunities are also for the private market?
Obviously this isn't anything new, but I'm going to say AI, especially AI data centers. What's, the easy pick in there has been NVIDIA, right? They make the chips for AI that fill these data centers.
Except DeepSeek came out.
Yes, and we'll see what that means. But nonetheless, there's going to be a lot of chips, whether they're NVIDIA chips or someone else's chips, and there's going to be a lot of data centers. So think about the data centers and the massive amount of energy they consume. So, for instance, we hold stock in a natural gas pipeline company because in America, that's basically our source of energy. Solar and wind are just too small and they're not really efficient. Nuclear is very limited. It takes 10 years to build, and we haven't even started building, really. And coal is slowly being outlawed. So natural gas is by default going to pick up a big part of that. But we don't like natural gas producers because their profit or loss is based on the price of natural gas. And that, if you look at a graph, it jumps all over the place. It's based on the weather, and there's a lot of supply of natural gas from all these shale wells now. The pipelines just charge a fee. It's like riding the train. They charge the fee, so they don't care if the price of natural gas is $10 or $1. They're just collecting their toll on the energy highway.
Collect their toll. Yeah, that's funny how you describe it as a toll.
Toll on the energy highway. And then the other thing is, we own a company. It's classified as a utility, but really what they do is they help utilities build out their infrastructure. They're not their earnings are not subject to the typical variations that utilities face based on, again, weather and cost of energy. They're more of an industrial type company, construction type company, parts supplier. So there are various ways to take advantage of the AI boom. And then you just look at companies like pharmaceuticals. If you now have AI that can help you test and generate new drugs, new, all kinds of different ways of analyzing our bodies, it's a vast, we could progress at a much greater clip. Even companies that produce toilet paper, if they can do it more efficiently because of AI, they benefit. So there are benefits to a lot of companies and industries that you wouldn't necessarily think there would be.
Talking about the infrastructure, so do you think United States has been talking about infrastructure for the past many years? Well, as we can see, all the airport and stuff, like they look bad. They look like a third world country easily. So do you think the whole infrastructure is going to take off again? Let's say the construction part, things that needs to be rebuilt, roads that needs to be fixed, all that.
Politicians love infrastructure projects because they can send money to their homes, to their, where they get elected. It's great for a politician to get on stage and say,
that's a good point.
Well, I was senator, and when I was senator, we built this bridge and we did this and we did that, and I was able to secure all this money. So both sides of the aisle love infrastructure, and they're always talking about infrastructure. Right now, I don't think it's as likely because they're so focused on the deficit. Mm-hmm. But once this economy starts slowing down, and if we start getting near a recession, my guess is you're going to hear all about infrastructure.
那这就是一个非常有意思的例子了。那从政客的角度上来说呢，如果说经济不好，那政客们会从政府能够掌握的一些行业里面去想办法提振经济。那这时候这个建筑材料相关的行业就成了赢家。那如果有机会可以进入到一级市场的话，那经济衰退反而成了一个很好的投资时间点。At this moment, nobody is really expecting the economy to be very good. Like there's a lot of ambiguity there. There's a lot of uncertainty. Is there something like a safety area for investors during the downtime?
Yeah, I mean, it's important that there's perceived safety sectors, right? You always think of consumer staples and utilities. But I think what's more important to look at is not necessarily by the industry, although that's part of it. That's certainly part of the equation, but their valuation. Utilities have been doing better over the last 9 months, in part because of AI. So the question is, if the market were to really turn down and the economy goes into a recession, would utilities hold up much better than the market? And when their valuations are high, the odds are the answer is no. When their valuations are low, the odds are, the odds are much better that it will. So, it's important to focus not just on what sectors and industries tend to do better, but what are the prices of those and how might they change?
那除了从这个政府开销的角度上来看呢，我个人还有一个称作打不过就加入的逻辑。也就是说，如果从企业或者项目运营的角度上出现这个借贷利率太高，或者是说呢难以贷款的情况，那我们是不是可以换一个角度，咱们是不是可以加入这个放贷的这个阵营？
As I kind of think about what potentially, how you could diversify yourself today and how you might protect yourself tomorrow, is thinking about industries or investments, not necessarily a stock, that are related to bond yields. So if bond yields fall, bonds take advantage of that. The price change of bonds can be double digit or more. They can rise significantly in price. Plus you get the 4.5% annual coupon payment. It's when you start getting into the private sector, it's really more a question of the environment matters, but it's a question of who are you lending to, and are you getting paid for the risk that you're taking? So I'm looking right outside my window, right in front of me. They're building a new building. So the question, if I were going to lend them money, is, well, how's the economy look? Can you fill it up with tenants? What are the odds that you don't and that it fails? And are you paying me an interest rate that if it fails, I'll be okay? Or, it accounts for that. So there are going to be a lot of failures in the private lending industry, but also a lot of successes. So those people that can manage these funds and make good loans, just like a bank, exactly like a bank. There were banks that did great in 2008 because they didn't get involved in making a lot of loans at very low margins. They pivoted and got away from the housing market and did other things. So I think it's the same with private credit. If you are smart and aware of the environment, you can do well. Public market is, the problem with stocks is that their price changes every day. So we all get emotional. Investors get emotional because it went up a lot, it went down a lot. And a lot of that is just sentiment. It's just like term premium. It's just moving around because that's what they do. Your private sector funds move around, but you don't see it because you don't show the price. You show it once a month, once a quarter. So it becomes less emotional. And I feel like in private investments, because the price isn't changing constantly, you can make more rational decisions. I just kind of finished an article about an hour ago on behavioral economics. It's really the intersection between our behaviors and us not being rational human beings and the way we invest. And how we manage all those biases that we all have. Like you said, there's an aversion to losses. And we get greedy at times. And all the economic books say that people are rational. We're not rational. No one is rational, especially not my wife.
我们来总结一下哈，这一期呢，我们提到的这个美联储呢，现在是处于一个非常尴尬的境地，明明是在降息，但却降出了一个加息该有的市场反应。当然了，这里面川胖也是有不少功劳的哈。不过整体来说呢，现在市场是一个卡住了的状态。那我们还需要看一下未来至少几个月的这个宏观数据走向，它是不是稳定？比如说呢，像通胀率啊、就业情况啊，还有川胖那边的贸易和政治环境，是不是可以少折腾一点？总之呢，这些都给市场增加了很多的不确定性。另外呢，我们还提到了关于市场机会的问题，也就是说，我们其实需要更多关注市场里面的机会在哪儿哈，而不是只关注宏观的趋势。咱们都说这个细节决定成败嘛，那在宏观走势不是那么明朗或者不是很正面的时候呢，我们就更需要关注怎么样接触到逆势上行的资产，而且往往就是在这种绝大多数人的恐慌的时候呢，翻盘的机会才是最大的。那好，这一期呢我们就先说到这儿，咱们下期见。